When you have a project that's new, when you want to create a company, when you want to do a book, when you want to do a film, you have to start with small experiments. Because if you look at the creativity research, if you talk with entrepreneurs, if you talk with people who are artists, and really study the creative processes, the fact is, and we've all kind of come to see this, that this ingenious idea notion is way overrated. And the fact of the matter is, if you look at David Galenson, who's a researcher out of University of Chicago, two types of innovators. There are people like Mozart who come up with ideas instantaneously and transcribe them down on pieces of paper and come up with something that's unique and innovative. But what's far more common is the way Beethoven worked. Beethoven, for those who've studied his creative process, experimented all the time. And he failed a lot, constantly in his, if you look at his manuscripts, they were just full of pockmarks and changes where you could see his pen quill had just completely gone through the paper late at night in some toil that he had to go through. Galenson calls these types of people experimental innovators. And so, if ideas have to be discovered, whether it's a Frank Gehry building or Starbucks, the original Starbucks, the first Starbucks that Howard Schultz created in Seattle, had been inspired by the Italian coffee experience that Howard had seen in Milan. The first store in Seattle had nonstop opera music playing. The baristas were all wearing bow ties, which they hated. They just hated. And there were no chairs. So as Howard said, we had to make a lot of mistakes to discover what was going to work. Now the same is true for Pixar. Pixar, how many people know that Pixar was a hardware company when it began? A few people. Pixar was a hardware company. And Ed Catmull, who was the founder of Pixar, had this dream in the early 1980s, and that dream was to create a full-length digital film. Now, nobody thought that was realistic because the storytelling didn't exist in that medium. The actual technology, the software didn't exist, nor did the hardware technology. So Catmull sets out with this dream to create full-length film. Now, how did they begin? What was their starting point? They're beginning towards that dream. Short films. And the first short films that Pixar created were so rudimentary and crude, you would look at them today and say that it looks like just complete trash. It's garbage. Their second film, what happened to Pixar? Well, they were part of Lucasfilms, then they got sold. Who bought them? Steve Jobs. When Steve Jobs bought Pixar, he thought that Pixar was going to be the next great hardware company. Never, when Steve Jobs bought Pixar, did he think that they were going to make money on films. This is a true story. So again, point back to Galenson's. This idea that these visionaries come up with these ideas fully completed when they start something new is a myth. Not even Steve Jobs knew that Pixar was going to be able to create a full-length film. They start making these short films. They go to Steve Jobs. They ask permission every year. They show it to an audience about this size, and they say to the audience, this is the 1 or 2 minute film that we've done for the year. We're showing the value of our hardware. And what happens? Pixar starts to get credibility as this great technology firm. And people watch these films and they say, God, that lamp, that small lamp talking to that larger, the parent lamp, they're squeaking. They're not even talking, but they seem human. And so they have these small wins that they keep building on. And so every year they have to go back to Steve Jobs. This is they being Ed Catmull, and Ed Catmull recruited to Pixar this guy, John Lasseter, who'd been an animator at Disney, been fired from Disney, and who'd come and believe the same dream as Catmull. And they would make these films, and Lasseter would literally be underneath his desk on a cot at night, sleeping and then waking up and doing more iterations on these short films. This was the operation for films at Pixar. The rest of the company was trying to sell hardware. But they were following this with these small bets. So a small bet is an affordable loss. It's something that is an achievable, affordable loss. So they would go to Steve Jobs and they'd say, we want to make these short films. It's going to cost basically John Lasseter's salary, who's on this cot, and just deeply believes in this work. And Steve Jobs every time said, yes, we'll make another short film. So every year they do this. You get a little bit longer. They'd figure out how to do the storytelling. They'd figure out how to do more of the software. They'd try to sell software. They could never sell the hardware, obviously. We know that because they're not in that business today. So they had to get rid of that whole business. They had to get more into software. They tried to sell software. They couldn't do that. Steve Jobs finally has a decision to make in 1988. And that decision is Catmull and Lasseter come to him with this idea for a short film. It's going to be a little bit longer. It's going to be a little bit more nuanced. They're going to present it to the industry event called CETA. And Steve Jobs has already invested $50 million in this enterprise. So he's being accused by people in Silicon Valley of having another failure right on his doorstep. And he has to make a decision whether to make a small bet on this film. $50 million versus approximately 100 and some odd thousand for Lasseter's salary. And barely does Steve Jobs make this decision to go forward with this short film. He tried to sell the company right, left, and center to Bill Gates, to Larry Ellison, to a whole bunch of strategic partners, decides to go forward with this short film. It wins an Oscar for short films. Talk about a small win, right? But they build off of that small win, and they go to Disney, and Disney says, we'll do a partnership with you to make a full-length film. First of all, they wanted to do it for 30 minutes, but Catmull didn't think they could do it longer than 30 minutes, but they said, if you can do it for 30 minutes, why not 90? So this is how Pixar made Toy Story. Lots of these small, affordable losses that they bet over and over again to learn how to do the storytelling, the technology, all the components to what will become a full-length film. And this is what drives great creativity. This willingness to make affordable bets, to try things that you're in the unknown on, following a vision, right? They had a vision for where they wanted to go with it. You have to have vision, but you have to be willing to suffer what we call affordable losses. Small bet after small bet after small bet. Now, around Pixar, they had a few successes, right? They had a string of successes. But after their first three, they brought on a director, Brad Bird, who had been doing films in live action. And Brad Bird would go on to direct The Incredibles. And when he interviewed with Ed Catmull and John Lasseter and Steve Jobs, they said to him, our biggest fear is of complacency. We want you to come in here and shake things up at Pixar. We want to be challenged to think differently. And Brad Bird is completely that type of person. He's unafraid. He's a complete renegade. And he said, okay, thank you for that invitation, basically. Came in with all these ideas for The Incredibles. They were very complicated. And I don't know how many of you have seen the movie The Incredibles, but it was for Pixar at the time a departure from a lot of the types of animation they were doing towards like a lot more of explosives and complicated animations. And the storyboarding process itself was just extremely complex. And the technologists at Pixar said, there's no way we can make this movie. And Brad Bird said, give me the black sheep at Pixar. Give me the artists who are frustrated. Give me the people who are dying to have their ideas heard, but nobody's listening to. And these types of people came and gathered around Brad Bird working on the storyboards for The Incredibles, and they ended up making that movie for less money per frame than Finding Nemo. Taking very different approaches to storyboarding, using techniques they hadn't used before, completely reinventing parts of the Pixar creative process. And so at Black Sheep, if you're a black sheep at Pixar, wow, that's pretty awesome. But I think in this room today, there are a lot of black sheep, right? How many of you think of yourselves as black sheep? I mean, pretty much this whole room is full of black sheep. But it's not easy, right? It's not easy. So what I think we need is new Freemasons for creatives. That's the black sheep that we need. And it needs to be this community and ecosystem of people who are like-minded, who are willing to be the artists who are frustrated, thinking differently about problems, but not just coming to events, but also connecting in many different ways as you go throughout the world to be able to pick up the phone and have friends in London, in Paris, and wherever who are black sheep, who are from many different parts of life. You know, some people are going to be the artists who are going to be pianists. We have Harold O'Neill is a pianist who's one of our artists in residence. He's a fantastic jazz composer. Another black sheep would be Beth Comstock, who is at GE, who is actually an artist, kind of a sheep in wolf's clothes, if you will. She's an artist inside GE, and she loves Harold, and they can conspire on different things. And if you bring these two groups of people together, the power structure, if you will, together with the creative talent, you can solve a lot of problems that have been made extremely bad by management thinking, which just isolates people completely away from culture and the creatives. So that's what we're very early days working on. And we have Outpost in London, and we have actually, coming up next, one of our first thought leaders in residence, Alexa Clay, who is coming out with a book either later this year, early next, that's called The Misfit Economy, which is just an awesome expression of black sheep and of these creative revolutionaries making a big impact in these new economies that are developing. So we're in an amazing place. You're here because you're a black sheep for the most part, and I'm just grateful to be able to share a bit about Little Bets and to encourage you to just begin and fight through that fear that even Frank Gehry experiences, to make these affordable bets and to remember that you're part of something much larger than just you and your immediate group around you. You're part of a revolution that is building, I believe, that is a revolution that will be improvised, because it will be a bunch of creative, very resourceful, very dynamic thinkers like you that are going to help bring the humanity back into a lot of our systems that have become so rigid, and the industrial era back to the Enlightenment that have just cut off our humanity in many of these places. So thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you so much for having me here today. And get ready for Alexa Clay, who is a fantastic new voice and a great black sheep. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
It's only with the presence of rules that play can emerge. And I know that you think about, like, when you're thinking about creativity, you think of what are some constraints, some great constraints to help us come up with new ideas. Constraints are helpful. Well, that's what games are, right? They're just rules. And then the game actually doesn't exist. Talk about phenomenological. The game doesn't exist until it's played.